Thank you and good morning, Your Honors. This is case number IT 95518T. The prosecutor versus Radovan Karadžić.
Thank you. Could I have the appearances? The prosecution first.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors, everyone in and outside the courtroom. Alan Teeger, Hildegard Ertz-Retzlaff, and Ian Reed in the courtroom presently for the prosecution. We will be joined during the course of presentations by Katrina Gustafson and Melissa Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Teeger. For the defense.
Dobro jutro.
Good morning, Your Excellencies. Good morning to all. I'm going to introduce only my main legal advisors in court, Mr. Peter Robinson, Goran Petronijević, and Marko Sladojević.
We have another legal advisor in the courtroom, Mr. Karadžić. Do we not? Why don't you introduce your... Oh, yes, I missed that. My apology, Mr. Petronijević. Yes, Mr. Harvey, for the standby counsel, please.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors, Dr. Karadžić, everyone in the courtroom. Richard Harvey, assisted by Mirjana Vukajlović for the standby counsel.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. Yes, we heard the evidence of the first prosecution witness about 4.5 years ago in April 2010, and the defense case was closed about 5 months ago in May 2014. We have now reached the stage of the proceedings in this case to hear the closing arguments of the parties pursuant to Rule 86 of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence of the Tribunal. The Chamber has ordered that the prosecution and the defense shall have 10 hours each to present their closing arguments and 1.5 hours each to present their rebuttal and rejoinder arguments respectively. Before giving the floor to the prosecution, I would like to state on the record that on Friday evening, the Chamber, through its legal officer, sent the parties a list of questions via email, which the Chamber wanted the parties to consider and incorporate in their closing arguments in the coming days. I believe that the parties have all received those questions. In this regard, I would like the parties to identify the questions before answering them for the record. Further, I would also like to apologize to the parties for the fact that these questions were sent late on Friday evening, but the Chamber felt that even such short notice would be better than simply raising those questions in court and potentially surprising the parties. However, that is not to say that the Chamber would not have additional questions that may arise during the course of the closing argument. Now, Mr. Teeger, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Honors, in August of 1992, when one Bosnian Muslim or Bosnian Croat community after another was being destroyed or terrorized, the ICRC president explained what the world by that time knew. Quote, "Let me give you the sad picture. The civilian population is systematically harassed. Thousands of civilians are arrested in their homes, brutalized, or even killed. Whole minority groups comprising tens of thousands of civilians are systematically transferred by force. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been besieged for several months in cities such as Bihać, Derventa, Gorazde, Sarajevo. Detainees, the majority of whom are civilians, are held in conditions of extreme hardship in places of detention which are totally inadequate for that purpose. They are ill-treated, and hundreds of them have been executed. When internationals confronted Karadžić about these massive crimes, he deflected them with claims of Serb victimization or offered pretextual assurances of his good intentions. And now, after hundreds of witnesses, nearly 50,000 pages of transcript, more than 10,000 exhibits, the policy of ethnic cleansing is fully exposed, and Dr. Karadžić revealed as its driving force. And the man who bragged at the time about the painstaking steps he had devised and was implementing, but now pretends they never existed. Who promotes a revisionist history of events that denies thousands and thousands of crimes. Who praised and promoted those who implemented his criminal policy, but now, anticipating that his revisionist history is beyond belief, blames those who did his dirty work. Who orchestrated an effort to hide and destroy incriminating documents and crafted a defense based on falsehoods by his still loyal and compliant followers in court. Who falsely asserts that the indictment against him criminalizes all Serbs, thus willingly tarnishing the reputation of the Serb people in order to hide behind them. And who was known as a liar to the internationals with whom he dealt at the time, Akashi, Owen, Rose, Smith, Vance, Oken, and who continues to propagate his false stories in court. As we now know, Karadžić told both his victims and followers what would happen, and it did. Thousands killed, hundreds of towns destroyed, masses forcibly displaced. The focus on these massive crimes, however, risks losing sight of the individual victims, whose tragedies, one by one, are his responsibility. The brief accounts that follow of three victims are a reminder of one unique person after another, whose loved ones will never see him or her again, whose contributions to the world will never be realized, or of the many who struggle on a daily basis with physical pain or terror that can never fully be left behind. People such as the late Suleiman Crnčalo, who with his family and scores of other non-Serbs from Pale municipality was expelled from their homes and forcibly transferred to Sarajevo in July 1992. He and his family lived the rest of the war in constant fear that one of them might be killed by a sniper or a shell. He burned furniture and books to keep warm and saw people shot before his eyes and corpses which couldn't be collected for burial because of the continuous sniping and shelling. On August 28, 1995, his wife made her way to the market to pick up powdered milk for their children. She never returned, killed by the mortar shell in scheduled incident G19. She was buried at night, by then a Sarajevo custom, so that mourners could pay their respects without getting shot or shelled. Or a witness known here only as KDZ 69, who in July 1995 was a 17-year-old schoolboy living with his family in Srebrenica. As he and his father sought to join the column fleeing towards Tuzla, they became separated. He never saw his father again. After KDZ 69 and many others from the column surrendered, they were forced to run to Sandici Meadow, where between 1,000 and 2,000 captured men were held. He was loaded onto one of several trucks, packed so full with people that his body was numb, held overnight, and refused water. The next day, they were brought to Petkovsky School, where they were beaten and abused, and waited, soaked in their own urine and parched with thirst, listening to the bursts of gunfire as men were brought out of the school and shot. They were then ordered to remove their shoes and clothes to the waist. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They were crammed onto another lorry and driven to the Petkovsky Dam execution site. Despite the knowledge that their death awaited, many of the men were so thirsty that they were screaming, "Give us water and then kill us." They were ordered off the trucks 5 at a time, ordered to lie down, and shot. Miraculously, despite being repeatedly shot, KDZ-69 did not die. But he watched as others were led to their death, watched as a man moaning in agony beside him was shot in the head. And as he lay in unbearable pain and suffering from immense thirst, he prayed to die and thought of his mother who would never know where he was. Yet he survived, and once the soldiers had left, rolled over dead bodies to another survivor so he could untie them and they could untie each other. Unable to walk over the course of 4 days, he made his way to Muslim territory, crawling and being carried at times by his fellow survivor. And just one more of the many heroic stories that cannot be told here. Dr. Eso Sadakovic of Prijedor, a doctor who had worked for the UN in the Pacific and in Africa, became a prisoner in Omarska. He was widely known as a deeply humane man who helped everyone he could. After most of the other doctors in Prijedor had been killed, shortly before dawn in early August, Dr. Sadakovic was called out and ominously told to bring his things. Fellow detainee Nusrat Sivats recalled those final moments. Quote, Dr. Eso stood up. He took his nylon bag in which he had a handful of cigarettes that the other prisoners had collected for him. He brought his dirty shirt and he headed for the door. We all stood up. We stood quietly. And then all of us spoke out loud and we said, Dr. Eso, thank you. Thank you so much for everything. He just turned back and he said, thank you, friends, and goodbye. We did not believe that there was such a criminal person in this world who would be able to kill a man like Dr. Eso. Unquote. What binds each of these tragedies and countless more is that they are the result of one of 4 criminal enterprises, or JCEs. First, an overarching JCE to forcibly displace Bosnian Muslims and Croats through crimes including persecution, torture, murder, extermination, and genocide. A JCE to carry out a campaign of sniping and shelling against the civilian population in Sarajevo for the primary purpose of terror. A JCE to take hostages to compel NATO to abstain from conducting airstrikes, and a JCE to eliminate the Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica by killing the men and boys and forcibly removing women, young children, and elderly. All distinct, although each broadly in service of the same goal of achieving a Serbian state on vast territories within Bosnia and Herzegovina. And what binds those JCEs together is Radovan Karadžić. I turn now to the overarching JCE. That JCE was rooted in Karadžić's determination that Bosnian Serbs would not be separated from Serbs in other parts of former Yugoslavia by the borders of a sovereign and independent Bosnia. As Bosnia moved closer to independence, Karadžić attempted to forestall it through negotiations, while simultaneously preparing to unilaterally keep Serbs from becoming a minority in a sovereign Bosnia if negotiations failed. He began with steps that replicated what minority Serbs had done in Croatia, such as regionalization and training camps. But by October 1991, Karadžić and the Bosnian Serb leadership had decided to, quote, move on, unquote, toward de facto solutions and the establishment of an ethnically separate state. Over the course of the following months, Karadžić led the SDS in the creation of the organs of that state and the establishment of its police and army. When negotiations failed and Bosnian independence was days away, Karadžić's municipality officials and police aided by his Serbian collaborators, began a series of takeovers that quickly left the Bosnian Serbs in control of vast amounts of Bosnia's territory. These takeovers were quickly followed by the cleansing and sometimes destruction of the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat communities, a process that would culminate in 1995 in the destruction of the Srebrenica enclave, to which many of those cleansed from their original municipalities had fled. I outlined the story of some of the masses of victims of the overarching JCE, and particularly Dr. Sadakovic. But whole communities, distinct and separate parts of the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat community, were also victims. For example, Prijedor. As described at paragraphs 3 and 5 of the Prijedor municipality summary in our brief, and contrary to Karadžić's false claim that Prijedor fell outside his influence and control, that's defense brief parasuit 217, Karadžić personally intervened to ensure that the SDS leadership there was committed to following his policies. Prijedor authorities received and implemented variant A and B, and indeed acknowledged that the physical takeover of the municipality on April 30th, 1992, was part of the implementation of the second level of A and B. In his efforts to distance himself from those in the field, Karadžić now claims that the takeover was a reaction to a BIH presidency order to commence combat operations. That's para 1534 of their brief. This is belied by not only the direct testimony from defense witness Miskovic, but by evidence of the elaborate preparation involved, as described at paragraph 6 of the Prijedor summary, including SDS municipal instructions to commence takeover preparations before the BIH presidency order. Prijedor's story is chilling, so let me tell it as clinically and as simply as possible. After the takeover, the persecutions of Muslims began. To put it in the succinct terms of one witness, it was like they were in a ghetto. P677, page 10. As described at paragraph 10 of the Prijedor summary, Muslims were subjected to travel restrictions, terminated from employment, even forced to wear white armbands to identify themselves as Muslims. That's P3478, pages 25 through 26. As described at para 12 of the Prijedor summary, commencing in late May 1992, area after area where the Muslims lived were attacked and destroyed by the VRS and the MUP, beginning with the shelling of Hambarin following an armed clash at a checkpoint. The VRS and MUP next turned their attention to the large area of Karadžić, where thousands and thousands of Muslims lived. Beginning on the 24th of May, it was shelled for 2 days. Serb forces then entered the area, rounding up thousands of people and taking them to camps. Up to 800 people were killed in the shelling and subsequent attack. And as I say, the remainder were taken to detention facilities. The defense attempts to characterize this as combat against a fierce adversary. That's found at 1543 and 1545 of their brief. But the evidence reveals that the Muslim forces, in quotes, were an ad hoc, poorly equipped, essentially quixotic force against a very powerfully equipped army. As the grotesquely disproportionate casualty ratio of more than 100 to 1 clearly reveals. That's adjudicated fact 1057. In any event, Your Honors, the evidence is clear that the attack was directed at the entire Karadžić community. 7,000 Muslims were detained, the majority of whom could not be considered Green Berets, even based on the Army's own inflated estimates. And compare 5398, a 1KK report about 7,000 prisoners, with D1743, stating that the total strength of the Green Berets was 1,500 to 2,000. Those houses not destroyed by the shelling itself were completely devastated over the course of the following months. And this destruction was carried out by the VRS, in the words of one defense witness, so that people would move away and have nothing to come back to. D-2265, pages 56 through 57. And mosques suffered the same fate for the same purpose. Next, the centuries-old Muslim old town of Starigrad was destroyed, quote, wiped from the face of the earth, unquote, following a quickly subdued one-hour attack by a small group of lightly armed Muslims. And as described in the scheduled incident charts A10.5, 10.6, and 10.9, in the latter part of July, the VRS and MOOP cleansed the Brdo and Brešovo areas. The vague defense suggestions that these were legitimate combat operations in which there was some collateral damage are completely untenable. VRS reports in May and July reflect that there were only a handful of alleged Green Berets with a, quote, insignificant, unquote, number of light weapons who were either surrendering or living in the woods or underground shelters in groups of 5 to 10. See D-1743 or P-3317. The evidence is clear. The operation against the Brdo was an operation to expel the population through, quote, intimidation, unquote. And see the Priador summary footnote 86. At least 300 to 350 people were killed in the Brdo, and that is known to be only a portion of the total number of people killed. Indeed, another independent estimate was 500 to 700. These bodies were taken to Tomasica mine, and the remainder of those Muslims cleansed were taken to Omarska, Karaterm, or Ternopolje, where many died or were killed. Another 68 were killed that same week in Brešovo, a Bosnian Croat village. Over 100 people were taken from Mishka Glava to Lubia football stadium, where at least 15 were killed. In his brief, Karadžić disingenuously asserts that the others were released the day after. That's para 1558, failing to mention that their release from Lubia Stadium was being taken to Kaip, where over 90 men were executed, their bodies thrown into a hole and covered up with an earth mover. And see scheduled incident chart A10.7. I mentioned the camps to which the survivors of those cleansings were taken. Those were Omarska, Karaterm, or Ternopolje. We turn to Omarska. As described at para 20 of the Priador narrative, Omarska was set up under crisis staff authority by the written order of Police Chief Darliacha and secured by the police with VRS and territorial defense backup. As described in Scheduled Incident Chart C20.2, thousands of prisoners lived in horrific conditions, crammed together in unhygienic conditions. Even the commander who testified here acknowledged that a terrible stench pervaded the room into which prisoners were crammed, with near starvation rations. Just watch P6686, a video depicting emaciated prisoners ravenously wolfing down a bean soup that they had been given to impress journalists. Interrogations were conducted by MOOP and military police investigators. Beatings were routine during interrogations, sometimes beating people to death. That's T-44-225 and 44263. As the commander of the camp admitted here, very seldom did a beating not occur, which he knew in part because he heard the screams of the detainees throughout the day. Outside interrogations, there were indescribably vicious beatings or just routine beatings. For example, when detainees tried to use the fetid toilet facilities or go to the canteen for their meager portion of bread. and particularly in the White House, where prisoners were held for special mistreatment. Women were also held in Omarska, used during the day to clean up the blood and tissue from beatings, and raped by night. On a daily basis in Omarska, bodies lay on the ground, often piled up like garbage to be removed by TAM truck. Prisoners feared, quote, every second, unquote, because they never knew who would be called out and never return. On a single occasion, approximately 180 prisoners were murdered by gunfire and their bodies loaded onto an excavator for disposal. Even the camp commander, the defense witness, admitted to over 100 killed, either in camp or taken away for liquidation and later exhumed. That's T44237 through 59. In particular, Muslim and Croat political and intellectual leaders and police officials were targeted for liquidation in an organized series of killings. And the bodies, when found, exhumed from mass graves. In Karadzic, detainees were also held in wretched and inhumane conditions, packed into blood-stained concrete warehouses with no space to lie down, with insufficient ventilation or access to hygiene, near starvation, dysentery, lice, routine beatings, and killings. And see Scheduled Incident Chart C20.3. Over the course of 2 particular days, the 24th and 25th of July, 1992, approximately 150 detainees were massacred in room 3 on that date. Trnopolje was used by Serb authorities to gather non-Serbs for deportation outside RS and to other parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina and third countries. Over 23,000 people had been detained there by the end of September 1992. Although conditions were not as barbarous or deadly as in Omarska and Karadzic, detainees were nevertheless beaten and raped. Scheduled Incident Chart C20.4. The defense assertion that Trnopolje was an open collection center where people came voluntarily is contradicted by overwhelming evidence, as set out in para 23 of the Prijedor summary, including Stakic's, defense witness, admission to the contrary, T45239. By 1993, over 80% of non-Serb villages were largely destroyed and uninhabited. Virtually all Muslim places of worship had been destroyed, and approximately 44,000 Bosnian Muslims and Croats had been expelled. The defense claims that the Muslims and Croats left Prijedor voluntarily, citing as an example KDZ 26. That's at para 1537, footnote 3463. This is a man who left Prijedor when he was shipped from Omarska to Manjača. Karadžić also ignores the testimony of his own witness Stakić that in 1992, Muslims were expelled from their homes and compelled to leave out of fear, and that the police and army committed mass crimes against Muslims and Croats, including detentions, torture, mistreatment, and killings. But a large number of Muslims would never leave. In 1993, Darliacha informed the Bosnian Serb leadership about the 5,000 Muslim bodies thrown into Tomasića mine for which he sought help in disposing. P 1483, pages 154 through 55. Let me turn next to Sanski Most and relate just what the defense evidence reveals about what happened in Sanski Most. For confidentiality reasons, I will use letters in lieu of witness numbers and then provide the source in closed session. The SOS, quote, carried out tasks that the local SDS leadership required them to do, unquote. They were a quote, armed formation, unquote, under the command of the SDS. That's Site A. This armed formation blew up Muslim property and remained a paramilitary force until placed under the command of the army. Site B. Disarming was not aimed at the Serbs, but at the Croats and Muslims, quote, the opponents, unquote. By 11 May, Muslims and Croats from most places had already surrendered their weapons voluntarily, either to the police station or civilian defense. Site C. Crisis Staff President Rashila issued an ultimatum to the SDA to leave the municipality building or they would be attacked. The SOS shot a Zolia projectile at the building without knowing whether anyone was in the building or not, and 2 or 3 offices were set on fire. Site D. Dismissals. Non-Serb judges and court officials were removed before May of 1992. By then, quote, differentiation, unquote, a euphemism for dismissals, had already taken place in the police and other organs. Site E. Before the shelling of Mahala on the 26th of May 1992, the Army informed the crisis staff. And although it was known that civilians, that is families, lived in Mahala, nobody told the Army Commander Basra to watch out for civilians. Quote, naturally, unquote, people got killed. In addition, most of their homes were destroyed by the shelling or by the military setting fire to their houses afterwards. Residents couldn't go back to their homes because, quote, their houses, the neighborhood, was destroyed, unquote. Site F. After a Čistjenje, that is a cleansing or mopping up, in Vrhpolje or Hrustovo, people were killed on a bridge and thrown into the water. Site G. Following military operations against Muslim villages, the army put people on buses and brought them into town. The village was burned, destroyed, and the army collected the able-bodied military-age men and handed them over to the civilian authorities for interrogations. Site H. The army rounded up a large number of persons from Mahala, Muhici, Otaka, Vrhpolje, and Hrustovo. Many people were taken to detention facilities who were, quote, not supposed to be there, unquote, because the military did not distinguish between people. Quote, they just imprisoned and arrested only able-bodied men, put them on buses, and then handed them over to the civilian authorities, unquote. People were later transferred to Manjača who hadn't been processed at all. Quote, they just put a label on them as being prisoners of war, unquote. They did not differentiate. That's Site I. The crisis staff created Betonirka, and the warden of that prison was answerable to the crisis staff. But all the elements of Serbian authority, the police, the civilian authority, and the military, were in charge of resolving the issue of prisoners. Betonirka was not a remotely suitable place to keep prisoners, and conditions were, quote, most definitely inhumane. Site J. The crisis staff was the highest authority. Rashila was president of the municipal assembly and consequently the crisis staff. Verkesh was his deputy. Rashila went to ARC crisis staff meetings and would, quote, convey what was concluded there, unquote. And the Army Commander Basra also attended most crisis staff meetings. Site K. The municipal authorities put members in charge of resettlement who would compile lists of people who wanted to relocate, compile transportation lists, and decide where these people would go. A, quote, voluntary, unquote, departure meant someone requested to leave because they didn't feel safe. That's Site L. And they didn't feel safe given the events I just described. Communications always functioned from April to December 1992, although during 7 to 10 days in May, communications were interrupted because of war activities. And finally, the SDS had absolute power, which they exerted through their various bodies and through the crisis staff in particular. That's Site N. Quote, from the SDS line, from the top leadership within Republika Srpska down to the local level of the SDS, because the policy was formulated by the SDS. So it went from the top, from the president of the SDS, Radovan Karadžić, down to the local board of the SDS in Sanski Most. It was at that level that the main policy was formulated and carried out. Site O. Now, as mentioned, this is simply the defense evidence about Sanski Most. In addition, the evidence overall reveals such things as the president of the crisis staff before the Mahala operation ordered that all with arms were to be killed, and that, quote, captured civilians, unquote, were to be, quote, used for exchange. That's P3329, page 33. Or that one of the categories for detention and expulsion was being a person who was, quote, unwelcome in Sanski Most municipality, P2639, and that the crisis staff's official organ, quote, the informator, declared that Muslims were not a people and Croats carried a genetically pathological desire to kill those superior to them. It is equally instructive to shift our focus to the other side of Bosnia, where Karadžić's preparation both within Bosnia and with his benefactors in Belgrade led to an essentially Muslim-free municipality. As Karadžić said in January 1993, there were still 50,000 people in Zvornik, but now, quote, they are all Serbs, unquote. That's P794, page 4. The defense depicts Zvornik's takeover and its aftermath as the work of paramilitaries from Serbia outside the control of the Zvornik authorities. In fact, the evidence shows a carefully coordinated operation between paramilitary and Bosnian Serb forces carried out at the behest of and with the full cooperation of the Republic and local authorities, who worked together with paramilitaries in committing systematic crimes against Zvornik's non-Serb community. The preparation for takeover began with Zvornik's receipt and implementation of variant A and B, forming a crisis staff within 2 days. Find that at para 4 of the Zvornik summary. Indeed, immediately before the conflict, Karadžić used Zvornik as an example of how takeovers were to be effected. That's P961, page 22. As described in the Zvornik summary, para 6, the Serbian paramilitaries sent in by Karadžić's Belgrade collaborators were welcomed into Zvornik by the local authorities and assigned to TO brigades. Interim government president Brano Grujić confirmed that they, quote, I just said welcome. Go to headquarters, to the command, and you should be deployed and go and protect our people, unquote. That's T40384. Together with the Bosnian Serb police, TO, and the JNA, they effected a brutal takeover in which dozens of civilians were killed. See the Zvornik summary at para 12. As described in paras 20 through 28, following the takeover, widespread cleansing operations were carried out, coordinated between the Bosnian Serb forces and civilian authorities. Non-Serbs were arrested and detained at various detention centers where they were subjected to mistreatment and killings. And again, the defense tries to lay the entirety of the blame on paramilitaries, claiming at para 1448 of their brief that these illegal prisons were operated by paramilitaries. But in fact, the Zvornik authorities were heavily involved in the illegal detention of Muslims at these facilities, including the guarding of the facilities, transfer of detainees between facilities, and even the mistreatment at the facilities, all in full knowledge of the crimes which were occurring there. For example, Muslim detainees at the Alhos factory were severely mistreated, not only by Arkon's men in White Eagles, but also by the Serb police. Moreover, the Bosnian Serb interim government was based in Alhos. See Scheduled Incident Chart C27.3. The more than 190 men murdered by gunfire at Garo's slaughterhouse were brought there by police, following which Serb forces, including guards in JNA uniforms, killed them. The cleanup of those bodies reflected a level of organization beyond mere paramilitary involvement. See Scheduled Incident Chart A16-3. And as described in charts B20.3 and C27.2, detainees at Karadžić Technical School were held on order of the TO commander, that's KW317 T39367, and guarded by the Zvornik Brigade's Karadžić Company, in addition to paramilitaries. Approximately 160 men were interrogated, beaten, and shot at the school. Another 25 disappeared after purportedly being brought for prisoner exchange.
Would you kindly slow down a little for the interpreters, please?
The defense claim at paragraph 1453 that the local leadership was unaware of the crimes at Karadžić Technical School is contradicted by numerous OTP and defense witnesses, one of whom described it as a generally known secret, that's Site P, and another who acknowledged it was the talk of the town, P6405, pages 4 through 5. As described in chart B20.2, Chelopak Dom Kultur was guarded by reserve police members. Detainees were sexually mutilated, forced to eat severed body parts, and over 25 detainees were killed. And Muslims were brought to and transferred between detention centers in Zvornik and on to Batković camp on interim government or TO orders accompanied by police. It's at para 28 of the summary. Your Honors, the crimes I've just discussed were not aimed at these victims as individuals, but as members of an undesired community. Karadžić's forcible demographic restructuring of Bosnia was to be accomplished by the destruction of substantial parts of the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat communities. And the proper name for this crime is genocide. Genocide is the commission of certain specified acts with the intention to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. In short, act plus intent. The jurisprudence of this tribunal reveals that these elements have been established in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the actus reus of genocide is established. And that includes killings and serious bodily harm and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Now, although the scale and impact of those crimes can play a role in the determination of intent, there is no requirement that the underlying acts of genocide reach a particular level. So, there is no numeric threshold for killing members of the group. There is no requirement that serious bodily harm have a particular impact. And with respect to 4.2c, conditions of life, you've asked about that. That provision is that deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part is an enumerated genocidal act, which, when combined with the requisite intent, constitutes genocide. Now, in response to your questions, Your Honor, it is clear from the preamble that, which distinguishes all these acts from intent, that the words, quote, calculated to bring about, do not add an intent element. Instead, it is a way of defining the nature of the act. So killing, by definition, doesn't require any further elaboration. And the nature of the bodily or mental harm required is defined by the word serious. But simply reciting serious conditions would be of little assistance in defining the act. So the framers identified the nature of the act by its potential to destroy. That is, whether it's sufficiently grave. And as for the finding of the appeals chamber that, quote, Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats were subjected to conditions of life that would bring about their physical destruction, about which you've asked, the appeals chamber was talking about the nature of the conditions as it affected individual members of the group, that is Bosnian Muslims and Croats, not the Bosnian Muslim and Croat community. The appeals chamber said that these were clearly enough to destroy individual people, which seems pretty obvious from the conditions like starvation. And in light of that, in light of conditions that could kill people, the evidence was sufficient to show the imposition of conditions serious enough to be considered calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group, that is, sufficiently grave. Further, the appeals chamber was making a factual determination, not attempting to articulate a legal standard, and particularly not one which would entirely subvert the, quote, objective probability standard used by the Berjanin trial chamber at paragraph 906, relied upon by this trial chamber at T28767, and which neither party challenged. Your Honors, in this case, where the evidence is so overwhelming that genocidal acts occurred on a massive scale, there can be no question that the actus reus of genocide has been met. So with that in mind, we turn to intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group. Intent to destroy means the intent to cause the physical demise of a targeted community. The Ptolemyr trial chamber emphasized that, quote, the physical or biological destruction of a group is not necessarily the death of the group members, unquote. That's at para 764, citing the Blagojevich and Jokic trial judgment at para 666. Now, this is reflected in the convention and statute, which expressly encompass genocide based on acts other than killing members of the group. So while the intent to kill all members of the group is perhaps the classical conception of genocide, these days it may not be the most paradigmatic and, in any event, is not the only method or form. Indeed, the tribunal has identified over time various factors, which are specified in para 574 of our brief, that may demonstrate genocidal intent. You see them on the screen. What these factors have in common is their pernicious impact on the foundations of life for the group, the foundations that allow the group to continue as such. You've asked about forcible displacement. While not a specified actus reus, and while it does not by itself constitute genocide, as our jurisprudence makes clear, it can be a powerful additional means to ensure the destruction of the foundations of life of the group, so that the group does not continue and cannot reconstitute itself. And you'll see that in context in just a moment. Because all of these factors must be viewed in the context of the totality of the criminal operations against the targeted group, in this case by Karadžić through his participation in the JCE. And when multiple massacres of group members have taken place, when many, if not most of the individual members have been brutalized, terrorized, and traumatized, when the group has been simultaneously deprived of its leaders, when their homes have been destroyed and razed, when their religious buildings have been reduced to rubble, when the group members have been forcibly displaced, that is, physically separated and scattered, when the familial, community, and historical fabric binding the group and its most sacred symbols have been destroyed, it is an inescapable conclusion that the very existence of that community has been intentionally attacked, revealing the goal to destroy the non-Serb communities where necessary to be at the heart of the common criminal plan. And in connection with the court's question, I hope you can therefore see the role that forcible displacement can play in the destruction of the foundations of life for the group. Dr. Karadžić's direct expressions of genocidal intent and his clear intention that the groups would not be able to reconstitute themselves simply reinforce this conclusion. And let me just return to Prijedor and focus on that by way of example. And recall what I've specified before. Up to 800 Muslim civilians killed in the first attacks, an estimated 350 to 700 more in the cleansing of the Burdo, 150 men in a single massacre in Karadzic. Similarly, 150 men detained at Omarska after Burdo, executed in the course of a single night. Killing so routine that prisoners feared death every second, with bodies piling up every day. Approximately 200 men who survived Omarska or Karadzic massacred at Koračanski Stijeni. 68 Bosnian Croats killed, that is, shot or hacked to death during an attack on Breševo. Over 100 Muslim civilians killed at Mishkaklava Dome, and then later at Ljubija football stadium, and then Kajp. The Bosnian Muslim, Bosnian Croat leaders targeted for killings and their bodies dumped in mass graves. Thousands and thousands separated from their families, taken to Omarska and Karadzic, where they were starved, denied medical treatment, beaten, sexually assaulted, tortured, and often killed. Thousands more taken to Ternopili until they were transferred outside the RS, often outside Bosnia. And meanwhile, to make sure that the survivors did not contemplate return, their houses, mosques, and cultural monuments leveled. In a few months, just a few months, thousands of Prijedor's non-Serb civilians have been killed, thousands more brutalized, beaten, tortured, subjected to sexual violence, and degraded. Their religious structures and symbols destroyed or badly damaged, their livelihoods, homes, and properties lost. They were then scattered around the world. By October 1992, roughly 38,000 members of the targeted groups had been expelled from the municipality, a figure which increased to 44,000 by May 1993. Taken together, these reflect an unmistakable intent to destroy the Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat communities of Prijedor. No other conclusion can fairly be drawn from the devastation of these communities. Now, it may not have been, as has sometimes mistakenly been claimed as the test, a systematic effort to destroy each and every group member, but it was plainly an effort and reflected an intention to destroy the community. And that intent is confirmed by Karadžić's own direct expressions of intent, as I stated, his statements anticipating, threatening, and embracing such acts. Over and over again, Karadžić made clear what would happen to the Bosnian Muslims and Croats if they persisted in pursuing independence. Not by force of nature, but at the hands of his forces. They would disappear, be annihilated, or be up to their necks in blood. Those are all quotes. He stood before them, wagged his finger, and told them they were headed for extinction. Now, he tries to paint himself as a beneficent visionary who foresaw troubled times. But Karadžić is not the building inspector who advises someone not to build on land because it's unstable. He's the mobster who says, don't build there, or I'll be forced to destroy it. And who does so when his warning is disregarded. As we explain in our brief at paragraph 580, Karadžić's rallying cry was that this was a genocidal struggle, that his followers had the right and duty to use reciprocal force. He knew full well the kind of force the Bosnian Serbs would use, while a largely helpless Europe was told, quote, to go fuck itself. D279, page 9. And after the conflict was underway, Karadžić acknowledged that the Muslims were vanishing and that it was roused by Europe to eliminate the Muslims. D92, page 86. In other words, Europe put us in this position, and now we have to do this thing. Now, the defense brief at paragraph 2769 cites Nedić, whose comment triggered Karadžić's remark. And Nedić came here and insisted that he never advocated the execution of Muslims, and he cited his comment, quote, "Let us not kill women and children for wearing Turkish trousers or whatever," unquote, and that he told a VRS colonel that he was not for genocide. Now, setting aside why Nedić felt compelled to tell the assembly that they shouldn't kill women and children, or tell the army that he was against genocide, the significance of the exchange with Karadžić lies in the fact that Karadžić agreed that Muslims were vanishing at the hands of his forces, the army, the police, and the crisis staffs. And Your Honors, when we return, I'd like to turn to the meaning of "in part" and the distinct nature of these communities.
Thank you, Mr. Tiga. We'll have a break for 20 minutes and resume at 10:20.
All rise.
Veuillez vous lever.